I worked the overnight shift at a gas station off Route 9, the kind of job you take when you're 22 and broke, and don't have the grades for anything better yet. 11 at night to 7 in the morning, 4 nights a week. The pay wasn't great, but the tips from the register jar added up, especially on weekends when the bars let out and half-drunk guys would toss their change in just to watch it clink. I used to tell my mom I liked the quiet. That was a lie. I hated the quiet. I just liked the extra 60, $80 a week it put in my pocket that I wasn't declaring on anything. That station sat alone on a stretch of road with nothing around it for almost 2 miles in either direction. Just trees, a drainage and a blinking yellow light at the one intersection. On a clear night, you could see the whole parking lot lit up like a stage under those buzzing fluorescent awning lights. On a rainy night, it looked like the edge of the world. The rain would come down sideways sometimes, hammering the metal roof so loud I couldn't hear the little bell over the door, and the lights outside would blur into these long yellow smears on the wet asphalt. I took that job mainly because the community college I was going to during the day didn't leave much room for a normal 9 to 5, and the overnight differential meant an extra $1.50 an hour on top of base pay, which doesn't sound like much until you're adding it up against rent. My manager liked me because I never called out and never fell asleep on shift, which apparently wasn't a given with some of the other guys who'd worked that slot before me. I kept a little space heater under the counter for the winter months and a fan for summer, since the store's own climate control was unreliable at best. And most nights I split my time between restocking, doing homework on my phone, and staring out at that empty road waiting for something, anything, to break up the monotony. It had been raining for 2 days straight that week. One of those systems that just parks itself over a region and doesn't move. I remember the radio kept cutting to weather warnings about flash flooding on the low roads, the kind of thing you half listen to while you're restocking cigarettes behind the counter. Business was dead. I think I rang up maybe 6 customers between 11 and 2 in the morning. A trucker getting coffee, a woman buying tampons and looking embarrassed about it. Normal stuff. Around 2:30, a car pulled in. I didn't hear an engine, which I remember thinking was strange, but the rain was so loud against the roof that I figured I just missed it. I looked up from my phone and there was a car parked at pump 3, an old sedan, maybe a 90s Buick, the kind of car nobody's grandparents drove anymore because they'd all sold them or scrapped them by now. No headlights on, just sitting there in the rain. I waited for someone to get out and either pump gas or come inside. Nobody did. 10 minutes went by. I remember getting annoyed, thinking maybe some kid was messing with me, and I walked to the door and looked out through the glass. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely make out the shape of the car, just this dark blob under the awning light, water running off it in sheets. I could see someone in the driver's seat, just sitting there, not moving. I want to be honest, at the time I wasn't scared, just irritated. I opened the door and yelled over to ask if they needed a hand with the pump, since some of the older ones on that side didn't always take cards first try. No answer. I stood there a second, got soaked from the wind, blowing rain onto the little strip of dry concrete under the overhang. And then I saw the person in the driver's seat turn their head toward me. I couldn't see a face. It was too dark and the rain was streaking down the windshield, but I could see the shape of a head turn, slow, like they'd been waiting for me to notice. I remember my stomach kind of dropped, not because of anything specific, just this feeling you get sometimes that something is wrong before your brain can tell you why. I went back inside. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was probably some old guy who'd pulled over to nap or wait out the worst of the storm before driving on. I sat back down behind the counter and tried to watch a video on my phone, but I kept glancing up at the car every few seconds. It didn't move. The person didn't get out. 20 minutes passed like that. Then the bell over the door rang. I looked up, and no one was there. The door was open, rain blowing in sideways onto the mat, but nobody was standing in the doorway. I remember calling out asking if someone needed help, thinking maybe a kid had run in and ducked behind the shelves as a prank. I got up and walked the 2 aisles we had, checked behind the chip rack, Checked by the coolers. Nothing. When I went back to the door to close it, I looked out at pump 3. The car was gone. Not pulled away, not driving off down the road, just gone. I hadn't heard an engine start, hadn't seen headlights swing across the lot, nothing. I stood in that doorway for what felt like a long time, just staring at the empty space under the awning where it had been parked, rain hammering down into a puddle that was already starting to reflect the yellow lights above it. Told my coworker about it the next day, the guy who did the day shift, half expecting him to tell me I was an idiot. Instead, he got quiet for a second and told me that around 3 years before I started, a woman had been killed in a car accident right at that intersection during a storm just like that one, and that some of the old-timers who used to work nights wouldn't take that shift anymore. He said he didn't believe in ghosts, but he also said he always made sure to leave before it got past midnight if he could help it. I worked there another 8 months after that. I never saw the car again. But there were nights, especially on ones like that one, heavy rain and dead quiet, where I would catch myself watching pump 3 out of the corner of my eye, just waiting, sometimes even hoping it wouldn't come back, and sometimes, in a way I still can't fully explain, almost hoping it would, just so I could get a better look, prove to myself I hadn't made the whole thing up out of boredom and bad lighting. I asked around a little after that, mentioning it to a couple regulars who came in for their morning coffee before work, mostly just to see if anyone else had a similar story about that stretch of road. Nobody had much to offer beyond vague memories of accidents happening out there over the years, the kind of thing every long stretch of rural highway seems to collect eventually. Nothing that confirmed what I saw, but nothing that ruled it out either. I quit that job before I ever found out if it was going to happen again. I don't know if I want to. I drove for a rideshare app for almost 2 years, mostly nights. Mostly the 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. window, because that's when the surge pricing kicked in and you could actually make decent money instead of just covering gas. Weekend nights especially, you'd get people leaving bars, and drunk people tip better than sober people. I don't know why, maybe guilt. Maybe they just don't do math well at that point. I used to keep a little notebook of which bars let out at which times, so I could time my routes. It sounds calculated typing it out now, but when you're trying to make rent, you learn the patterns fast. I had a whole system worked out by that point, actually. One kept a phone mount that let me glance at the map without taking my hand off the wheel. A little cooler in the trunk with water bottles for passengers, because it bumped my rating up half a star on average. And I always kept the interior spotless because drunk passengers notice. A clean car, even when they can't remember much else about the ride the next morning. I liked the job more than I expected to when I started. There was something almost meditative about driving the same stretches of road night after night, watching the same houses go dark one by one as the hours passed. This happened maybe a year into doing it. On a night in late October when it wouldn't stop raining, I remember because I'd had 4 cancellations in a row before this ride, people ordering cars and then bailing once they saw how bad the weather was getting, which cost me time and gas for nothing. So when this ride came through, a pickup from a residential street about 15 minutes from where I was, heading out to an address almost 30 minutes away, I took it without hesitating, even though the distance meant driving further into the storm. The pickup address was a small house set back from the road. No lights on except a porch light that flickered like the bulb was dying. I pulled up and the app said the passenger's name was Diane. I waited about 5 minutes, which isn't unusual. People take time getting out into rain like that. And eventually the back door opened and someone got in without me really getting a good look at her. Just a shape moving fast through the rain and into the seat. I said the usual thing, "Hey, you headed to the address on Miller Road?" She said yes. Her voice was quiet, kind of flat, and I remember thinking she sounded tired, which made sense. It was almost 1 in the morning. I pulled off and started driving. For the first 10 minutes, she didn't say anything, and I didn't push it. Some passengers want to talk, and some don't. You learn to read it fast if you're doing this every night. The rain was bad enough that I had my wipers on the highest setting, and I was going slower than usual, maybe 40 on a road where I'd normally do 55. I remember checking my mirror once, and seeing her staring straight ahead, not at her phone, not out the window, just forward. About halfway there, she said something. I didn't catch it the first time, so I asked her to repeat it, and she said, quiet, almost like she wasn't really talking to me, that she didn't think she was going to make it home. I laughed it off, said something like, don't worry, we'll get there. The roads aren't that bad. She didn't respond to that. A couple minutes later, I checked the mirror again, and I swear the back seat looked empty. Not that I saw her disappear, just that when I looked, there was nothing there, just the seatbelt hanging loose against the door. I remember my hands went cold on the wheel, and I actually said her name out loud, Diane, twice, and got nothing back. I pulled over onto the shoulder, hazards on, rain slamming the roof so hard I could barely hear myself think. And I turned around fully to look at the back seat. It was empty. No purse, no wet footprints on the mat, nothing. The door hadn't opened. I would have felt the change in air pressure and heard the chime. And it hadn't. I sat there for probably 2 full minutes just staring at that empty seat. Engine running before I made myself check the app. The ride was still active. It still said in progress, heading to the Miller Road address. I don't fully remember driving the rest of the way there, if I'm being honest. I think I was running mostly on autopilot, the kind of thing where your body does something and your brain catches up later. When I got to the address on Miller Road, it was a small yellow house with the porch light on, and I sat outside it for a minute before I made myself get out and knock, because some part of me needed to know if this was a real place or not. A man answered, older, maybe 60, in a bathrobe like I'd woken him up. I asked, feeling stupid, if a Diane lived there. He went very still and asked why I was asking. I told him badly that I'd been driving her and she'd disappeared from my car. He didn't call me crazy. He told me his daughter Diane had died in a car accident on that same road 4 years earlier on a rainy night, and that every year around that time he still sometimes felt like she was trying to come home. I ended the ride in the app manually and drove straight home, hands still shaking on the wheel the entire way, checking my rearview mirror more than I ever had before, even though I knew logically there was nothing back there to see. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying her voice in my head, that flat, tired way she'd said she didn't think she was going to make it home, and wondering if I'd somehow been the last person, living or otherwise, that she ever spoke to. I stopped taking rides after 1 a.m. after that, even though it cost me money, real money, the kind that mattered when rent was due. Some things aren't worth the extra tip, and I think I finally understood that in a way I hadn't before. Sitting in my car outside a stranger's house with an empty back seat and a story nobody was ever going to fully believe. I was a junior in college, studying for finals, and I used to stay at the library until it closed at midnight, because my dorm room had 2 roommates who treated quiet hours as more of a suggestion. It was maybe a 15-minute walk back to my building, most of it along a road that ran past the edge of campus, and then along a wooded stretch before it hit the residential dorms. There were street lights, but not many, and about half of them on that stretch had been out for as long as I'd been going to that school. Facilities kept saying they'd fix them. They never did. I liked studying at that particular library specifically because it had these old leather chairs in the back corner near the science section that nobody else seemed to know about, tucked away from the group study tables where people whispered and clicked pens the whole night. I'd bring a thermos of coffee and just camp out there for hours, headphones in, only surfacing when my eyes started blurring the periodic table into nonsense. The walk home never used to bother me. I'd done it probably 100 times by that point in my 2 years there, rain or shine, and I honestly used to think of it as a nice way to clear my head after hours of staring at notes. This was during finals, week in my sophomore year, so it would have been early December, and it had been raining on and off for days. That cold rain that isn't quite sleet, but makes you feel like your bones are wet. I remember I stayed later than usual that night, almost until 1, because I had a chemistry final the next morning, and I was behind. When I finally left, the rain had picked back up, steady, not a downpour, just enough to soak through your jacket if you didn't have a hood. I don't remember exactly when I first noticed the footsteps behind me. I think it was maybe 5 minutes into the walk, right around where the street lights start to thin out. At first, I just figured it was another student walking the same direction, which wasn't unusual that late during finals. But the footsteps had this specific sound to them. A wet slap against the pavement, splashing, like whoever it was wasn't avoiding the puddles at all, just walking straight through them. I slowed down a little to let them pass me, the way you do when you don't want to seem like you're speeding up out of fear, and the footsteps behind me slowed down too. I remember my heart starting to go a little faster at that point, and I told myself I was imagining the pattern, that it was a coincidence. I picked my pace back up. The footsteps picked up too, staying the same distance behind me, splashing through every puddle in exactly the same rhythm as before. I got to the edge of the wooded part of the road, where the trees came in close enough on both sides that the street lights barely reached the ground, and I made the mistake of turning around to look. I think I wanted to just see a person, any person, even a stranger, because a stranger walking behind me would have been less scary than what I actually saw, which was nothing. The road behind me was empty. No one there, not close, not far in the dark, nothing. But the footsteps didn't stop. I stood there for a second, frozen, listening, and I could still hear them, splashing, getting closer, even though there was nobody visible making them. I think that's the part I still can't explain to people when I tell this story, because it doesn't make sense even to me. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't sleep-deprived to the point of hallucinating. I was just standing on an empty road hearing footsteps that had no source. I ran. I'm not embarrassed to say it. I just ran all the way back to my dorm. And I could swear the entire way that I could still hear the splashing behind me, matching my pace no matter how fast I went, right up until I got to the door of my building and slammed it behind me. Once I was inside in the light, with other people around at the front desk, it stopped. Or I stopped being able to hear it. I'm honestly not sure which. I didn't tell anyone for a few days because I figured they'd think I was losing it during final stress, which happens to people. I've seen it happen to other students. But I mentioned it eventually to a girl on my floor who'd gone to that school for longer than me, and she got quiet and told me that a student had drowned in the drainage culvert that ran under that stretch of road years before either of us started, during a storm walking back from the library late at night, alone. I don't know if that's true. I never looked it up, honestly, because some part of me didn't want to confirm it. I still don't really know what to make of what I heard that night. I've gone back over it so many times in my head since then that I've started to doubt my own memory of certain details. Whether the footsteps were really as close as I remember, whether I really heard them the whole way home or just told myself I did afterward to make the story make more sense. I think that's part of what makes it stick with me, the not knowing, the way it sits in this gray space between something I definitely experienced and something my tired, stressed, finals week brain might have built out of nothing. I just know I never stayed at that library past 11 again. Not once, not even during finals the following year, and I made sure I always had someone walk with me if it was raining, even if it meant waiting around annoyed friends for 20 extra minutes while they finished up whatever they were working on. I drove long-haul trucking for almost 11 years before I switched to a regional route that got me home more nights than not. Back when I was doing the long stuff, I'd be out for a week or two at a time, sleeping in the cab more than in my own bed, living off gas station coffee and whatever diner happened to be open along whichever highway I was on that night. You get used to the solitude. Some guys can't handle it. They burn out after a year or two, but I liked it, mostly. It was quiet in a way that felt earned. I hauled mostly refrigerated freight in those years, produce and dairy mostly, which meant tight schedules because a late delivery could mean a spoiled load and a very unhappy client on the other end. That kind of pressure teaches you to push through weather you probably shouldn't be driving in, because sitting parked at a rest stop waiting out a storm costs you money in ways a desk job never would. I'd learned the mountain route well enough that I could practically feel the curves coming before my headlights caught them, which is part of why what happened that night still doesn't sit right with me, because I know that road. And I know what normal looks like on a dot. This happened on a run through the mountains. a route I'd done probably 50 times before, mostly at night because the traffic was lighter and I could make better time. There's a stretch of that highway that climbs for almost 20 miles through switchbacks with a drop on one side. That isn't fenced in most places, just a low guardrail if you're lucky. In good weather, it's not bad. In rain, especially heavy rain, it turns into one of the more dangerous stretches of road I've ever driven professionally. And I've driven a lot of bad roads. That night the rain had come on fast. One of those storms that rolls in over the ridge without much warning, and within 20 minutes I went from clear visibility to barely being able to see past my own headlights. I remember slowing down to maybe 25 miles an hour on switchbacks I'd normally take at 50, gripping the wheel with both hands, radio off because I needed to concentrate. About a third of the way up the climb, I saw someone standing on the shoulder up ahead, lit up by my headlights, soaked through, waving an arm. I'll admit my first instinct was not to stop. You hear stories, especially truckers, about staged breakdowns and worse, and picking up a stranger on an empty mountain road at night isn't exactly recommended in any training manual. But something about how this person was standing, hunched over like they'd been out there a while, made me pull over anyway. I think I just couldn't leave someone out in that. He got in without much conversation, an older man, gray hair plastered down with rain, wearing a jacket that looked too thin for the weather. He said his truck had broken down further up and he needed a ride to the next town where there'd be a payphone, which even at the time struck me as an odd thing to say, since payphones were mostly gone by then, but I didn't push on it. I just started driving again, slower than before, because visibility was getting worse, not better. We drove for maybe 10 minutes without much talk. Then, out of nowhere, he told me to slow down, that there was a washout ahead on the next curve. I hadn't seen anything yet, no signs, no warnings on my radio, but something about how flatly he said it made me actually listen, and I eased off the gas well before I needed to. Sure enough, coming around that curve, half the shoulder and part of the outer lane had collapsed away into the ravine below, a section of guardrail just gone, swallowed by the mud. If I'd been going my normal speed in that rain, I don't think I would have stopped in time. I pulled over right after that curve, shaking a little if I'm honest, and turned to thank him, to ask how he'd known. The passenger seat was empty, door still closed, seatbelt still against the door where it always sat, no wet seat. Nothing to suggest anyone had ever been sitting there at all. I didn't report it to dispatch because I didn't know what I would even say. I called it in as a road hazard, the washout, which was real and confirmed by the next driver who came through an hour later and had to be rerouted. I never told anyone about the man for years, mostly because I didn't want to be the guy at the truck stop everybody quietly avoids after that. I looked into it eventually, years later, out of curiosity more than anything. There had been a trucker who died on that exact stretch of road back in the 70s. Gone off the edge during a storm, body never recovered because of how steep the ravine was. I've since learned that this is a fairly common thread in accounts like these. A helpful stranger appearing out of nowhere during the worst possible weather, only to vanish once the danger has passed, as if whatever it was existed solely to get me through that one bad stretch of road, and nothing more. I don't know if that was him. I never will. Part of me thinks it doesn't really matter whether it was, because whatever it was, it kept me on the road that night instead of somewhere at the bottom of that ravine, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that I owe something to whoever, or whatever that was. Even if I never get an answer, I still take that climb slower than I need to. Every single time, rain or not, just in case. And I still find myself glancing at the shoulder on that stretch of highway more than any other part of my route, half expecting to see someone standing there again, soaked through, waiting for a ride I'm not sure I'd have the nerve to offer a second time. I bought my first house alone when I was 29, a small 2-bedroom place at the end of a cul-de-sac that backed up onto some undeveloped woods. I was proud of it in the way you are when it's the first big thing you've ever done completely by yourself. No roommates, no co-signer, just me and a mortgage. My family thought I was crazy for buying somewhere so isolated, but I liked the quiet after years of apartment. living with thin walls and neighbors who fought at 2 in the morning. Those first few months in the house were mostly spent painting rooms, hanging curtains, figuring out which floorboards creaked, so I'd stop scaring myself at night. The normal process of turning an empty house into something that felt like mine. I used to sit out on the back porch most evenings with a cup of tea, looking at the tree line, thinking about how lucky I was to have that kind of view all to myself, instead of a parking lot like my old apartment. I never once felt unsafe out there before that storm. If anything, the isolation had felt like a luxury up to that point, something I'd worked hard for and was proud of. About 4 months after I moved in, we had one of the worst storms the area had seen in years, enough that the power went out across most of the neighborhood around 9 at night. I wasn't too worried at first. I had candles, I had my phone charged, and storms usually meant an hour or 2 without power before the utility company got things back online. I remember sitting in my living room with a couple candles lit, listening to the rain absolutely pounding the roof, kind of enjoying the atmosphere of it, if I'm honest. The way you can enjoy a storm when you're safe and dry inside. At around 10, I heard knocking at the front door. Not urgent, not frantic, just a few slow knocks, evenly spaced. I remember pausing with my candle, waiting to see if it would happen again, thinking maybe a neighbor needed help or a branch had fallen on someone's car. It came again, the same slow, even pattern. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I got up and looked through the little window beside the door, but between the dark and the rain streaking the glass, I couldn't make out anything on the porch. No shape, no umbrella, nothing. I called out asking who it was. No answer. I remember standing there for a solid minute, candle shaking slightly in my hand, before I made myself open the door just a crack, chain still on. The porch was empty. Rain blowing sideways under the little overhang. Puddles forming on the concrete steps, but nobody there. And no car in the driveway or on the street that I could see. My hands were shaking a little by that point. Not from cold, since I still had power in terms of body heat, and the house wasn't drafty, but from something closer to pure nerves settling into my chest and refusing to leave. I remember setting the candle down on the entry table so I wouldn't drop it, and taking a few slow breaths the way I'd read somewhere was supposed to help with panic, though it didn't do a whole lot for me in that moment. I closed the door, locked it, and went to check the back of the house, mostly because I felt stupid standing around scared of nothing, and wanted to prove to myself there was a reasonable explanation. A loose shutter, a branch hitting the siding, something. As I was walking past my bedroom window, I saw something in the reflection of the glass, in the brief flash of lightning that lit up the yard outside. A shape standing at the edge of the woods, just standing there, facing the house, not moving despite the wind and rain. I didn't scream. I think I went very still instead, the way you do when your body decides freezing is safer than reacting. I watched through that window for I don't know how long, and the shape didn't move, didn't come closer, didn't leave, just stood there at the tree line like it was watching the house back. Eventually, another flash of lightning came, and in that flash, the spot where it had been standing was empty. The knocking started again about 10 minutes later, this time at the back door, the same slow pattern. I didn't answer it. I sat in the middle of my living room floor with every candle I owned lit around me until the power came back on close to midnight, and the knocking stopped sometime before that. I couldn't tell you exactly when, because I'd stopped tracking time by that point, just tracking my own breathing. I never found out what it was. No neighbor admitted to being outside that night. Nobody had storm damage that would explain knocking sounds, and there were no footprints the next morning, though I'll admit the rain probably would have washed those away regardless. For weeks after that storm, I found myself avoiding the back windows after dark, keeping the blinds shut even in rooms I never used to bother with, and I stopped sitting out on that porch with my tea in the evenings the way I used to love doing. The house never felt fully mine again after that night, no matter how many candles I lit or how many times I told myself it had been a fluke, a trick of the storm and my own overactive imagination working together against me. Put the house on the market about 8 months later. I told the realtor it was because the commute was too long, which wasn't entirely a lie, just not the real reason. She seemed a little confused when I pushed to accept the first reasonable offer instead of waiting for something better. But I didn't have it in me to wait around for another storm season in that house. Not after that. That wasn't really why I sold it, though. Not even close. A group of us used to go camping every Labor Day weekend. Same 5 friends since high school. Same lake. Same campsite if we could book it in time. It was a tradition by the time this happened, our 6th or 7th year doing it. We knew the site well, knew the trails, knew where the bathrooms were. About a quarter-mile walk from our tents through a stretch of trees, which sounds close until you're doing it at night with a flashlight. That's about to die. We'd started that tradition the summer after we all graduated high school, mostly as an excuse to keep seeing each other once everyone scattered off to different colleges. And it had turned into the one weekend a year we could count on all 5 of us being in the same place at the same time, no matter how busy our lives got the rest of the year. Jason was always the one who planned the food, kept a spreadsheet of who owed who for gas, that kind of thing, the reliable one of the group. He'd done that same walk to the bathroom probably 30 times across the years without a single issue. So none of us thought twice about letting him go alone that night. That year the forecast had called for scattered storms, and we almost canceled, but we'd all taken the time off work, and nobody wanted to be the one who backed out first. So we went anyway, set up in the afternoon while it was still dry, and by the time it got dark, the rain had started, light at first, then heavier as the night went on. We sat around a fire under a tarp we'd rigged up between 2 trees, drinking, talking, the usual. Nothing felt wrong yet. Around midnight, one of my friends, Jason, said he needed to walk to the bathroom. It was raining hard enough by then that nobody wanted to volunteer to go with him, and honestly none of us thought much of it. He'd made that walk alone plenty of times before on other trips. He took a flashlight, said he'd be back in 10 minutes, and walked off into the dark and the rain, laughing about something as he went. I don't even remember what. The rain had picked up even more by that point, hammering the tarp above us hard enough that conversation meant raising our voices a little, and the fire had shrunk down to mostly coals under the wet wood we kept feeding it, more smoke than actual flame. I remember checking the time on my phone out of habit, rather than real concern at first, just tracking how long he'd been gone the way. You might absent-mindedly clock anything in a routine you've done 100 times before. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. We started making jokes about it, saying he probably fell in a puddle, saying he was taking his time to avoid coming back to do dishes, that kind of thing. But by 30 minutes the mood had shifted, and 2 of us grabbed flashlights and went looking for him, following the trail toward the bathroom building. We found his flashlight about halfway there, lying in the mud, still on, beam pointed sideways into the trees. There was no sign of him past that point, no footprints we could make out in the mud and rain, nothing. We called his name for what felt like an hour, walking further off the trail than we probably should have in weather that bad, until one of the guys, Mike, said he heard something off to the side, deeper in the trees, a kind of low sound he couldn't describe as words exactly, more like a tone held out long. We didn't go toward it. I want to be honest about that, because in every version of this story I've heard other people tell about their own camping trips. Someone always investigates the noise, and we didn't. We turned around, went back to the campsite, called emergency services from the one spot near the parking lot where we could get a signal, and stayed together in one tent until park rangers and a search team arrived at first light. They searched for 2 days. They found nothing. No body, no further sign of him, nothing beyond that dropped flashlight in the mud. It wasn't declared an accidental drowning or an animal attack or anything conclusive at all, because there was nothing to base a conclusion on. He was just gone, in a stretch of woods maybe a quarter-mile from where 4 of us were sitting around a fire. Still don't know what that sound was that Mike heard. He's never wanted to talk about it since, not once in the years after, and none of us have gone back to that campsite. Or camping at all, really, not the way we used to. Jason's family held a memorial almost a year later. Once it became clear the search wasn't going to turn up anything more, and the 4 of us went together, sat in the same row, none of us saying much to each other beyond what was necessary. I remember looking around at his parents, his younger brother, all of them still holding on to some sliver of hope, even that long after, and not being able to look any of them in the eye for very long. We don't talk about that night much among ourselves either. Not the details of it anyway, not the sound Mike heard or what any of us think it might have been. I think we're each quietly hoping one of the others has an explanation the rest of us don't. Some detail we're each individually still missing that would make the whole thing make sense. And none of us ever do, so mostly we just don't bring it up. And the silence has become its own kind of tradition among us now, right alongside the empty seat we still leave open whenever the remaining four of us get together. I worked as a nurse on the overnight shift in a hospital's general ward for almost 6 years, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., which is a schedule that rearranges your entire life once you're on it long enough. I chose nights originally because the differential pay was better, and because, honestly, the pace felt calmer than days. Fewer visitors, fewer administrators walking around, just the patients and a smaller staff trying to keep everyone comfortable until morning. My drive to the hospital took about 25 minutes, mostly along a 2-lane road that cut through farmland before it hit the edge of town where the hospital was. There wasn't much out there, a few scattered houses, one gas station that closed at 10 and long stretches where you wouldn't pass another car for minutes at a time. Especially that late night shift nursing has a rhythm most people outside the profession don't really understand. You learn to eat full meals at 3 in the morning. You learn which patients tend to spike fevers right before dawn. And you learn to drive home squinting against a sunrise that feels wrong after a night spent under fluorescent lights. I chose that ward specifically because the acuity was manageable. Mostly stable patients recovering from procedures rather than the chaos of the ICU, which suited me better after a couple years of burnout on a busier floor earlier in my career. This happened during a stretch of bad weather in early spring. Heavy rain most nights for almost 2 weeks straight. The kind that made the drive genuinely stressful, even though I'd done it hundreds of times before. I remember being tired that particular night, coming off 4 shifts in a row, driving in with the wipers on high and the radio low, mostly just trying to stay alert. The wipers on my car had never fully kept up with heavy rain, even when they were new. And by that point in the car's life, they left these thin streaks across the windshield that made oncoming headlights smear into long white blurs, which didn't help visibility much at all. I remember turning the defroster up because the windows had started fogging from the temperature difference between the warm cab and the cold. Wet air outside, squinting through the glass more than I probably should have while still doing highway speeds. About 10 minutes from the hospital, I saw someone standing on the side of the road. No umbrella, wearing what looked like a hospital gown, thin, soaked through, standing at the edge of the ditch that ran along that stretch. I slowed down without really deciding to, some instinct kicking in from years of the job, the kind that makes you stop for anyone who looks like they might be a patient in distress. I pulled over onto the shoulder and rolled down my window. It was a woman, older, maybe 70, and she looked at me with an expression I can only describe as confused relief, like she'd been waiting a long time for someone to stop. I asked if she needed help, if she'd walked away from a facility somewhere, and she said very calmly that she needed to get to the hospital, that she thought she was supposed to be there. I told her to get in, thinking I'd bring her straight to the EA since I was headed there anyway, and she climbed into the back seat without much trouble. I remember trying to make conversation with her on the drive, asking her name, asking where she'd come from, and she gave short answers, distracted ones, mostly just repeating that she needed to get to the hospital, that they were expecting her. I chalked it up to confusion. Maybe early dementia, maybe medication-related, things I'd seen plenty of times before in patients who wandered. When we pulled into the hospital lot, I parked near the IA entrance and turned around to help her out. The back seat was empty. I want to say I handled that moment well, but I didn't. I sat there for a full minute just staring at an empty seat with a dry seatbelt. No wet fabric anywhere, nothing to suggest anyone had been sitting there at all. Even though I'd heard the door open and close when she got in, I was sure of that much. I went inside shaken and mentioned it to another nurse on shift, mostly just to say something out loud to another human being because I didn't know what else to do with what had just happened. She got quiet and then told me that years before I started working there, a patient matching that description, an older woman, had wandered out of the building during a storm just like that one and had been found dead in the ditch along that same road the next morning. Hypothermia, she thought, though she wasn't fully sure of the details anymore since it had happened so long ago. Don't know if that's the same woman I picked up. I never asked for more details because some part of me didn't want confirmation either way. I looked into hospital records after that, quietly, on a slow shift when nobody would notice what I was searching for on the computer, but records from that far back weren't digitized, and nobody I asked could point me to anything more concrete than the story the other nurse had told me secondhand. I don't know her name, the woman I picked up, or if she even has one to know at this point. I just know what I saw and what I didn't find in that back seat when I turned around. I still drive that road for every shift, because there isn't another route that makes sense given where I live. But I don't stop for anyone standing on the shoulder anymore. Not during storms, not ever, no matter how much they look like they need help. No matter how much some part of me still wants to. Because some habits from this job don't fully go away, even after something like that. I delivered pizza through most of college. Mostly weekend nights because that's when the tips were best. Especially late when people were drunk or high or just too lazy to cook. And either way, they usually rounded up. I worked for a small local place, not a chain, which meant no GPS tracking, on the delivery bags, and a manager who didn't ask many questions, as long as the food got there within 40 minutes. Delivering pizza taught me more about a town's geography than 4 years of actually living there ever did. Every back road, every apartment complex with numbering that made no logical sense, every gated community where you had to call ahead just to get buzzed in. Most nights were forgettable in the best way. Quick drops, decent tips, back to the shop for the next order. It was a good job for a broke college student, low stress most of the time. Cash in your pocket by the end of every shift, instead of waiting 2 weeks for a paycheck. There was one address on our regular delivery list that everyone on staff quietly avoided if they could help it. An old farmhouse about 15 minutes outside town, down a long gravel driveway with no other houses visible from the road. It ordered maybe once every couple weeks. Always late at night. Always a large pizza. Nothing else. No drinks. No sides. Paid in cash, left in an envelope taped to the door with the money already counted out, including tip. So you never even had to knock or wait for someone to answer. Nobody had ever actually seen who lived there. That was the thing that made it weird even before anything happened. Just an unspoken rule among the drivers that you dropped the pizza, took the envelope, and left without lingering, because something about the place felt wrong even in broad daylight, let alone at night. I drew that delivery on a night when it was raining hard enough that I almost asked another driver to swap with me, but nobody wanted it, so I took it myself. The gravel driveway turned to mud under my tires, and by the time I got to the house, my headlights barely cutting through the rain, I was already regretting not just calling the customer to say the delivery was delayed due to weather, which we were technically allowed to do. I left the headlights on and the engine running out of habit, something I always did on deliveries to places that felt even slightly off, just in case I needed to leave quickly without fumbling for keys in the dark and the rain. I got out, pizza box held against my chest to keep it dry, and jogged up to the porch. The envelope was there, taped to the door exactly like always. I set the pizza down, grabbed the envelope, and was turning to leave when I noticed the porch light, which had never been on for any of my previous deliveries there, was on that night dim, flickering slightly with the storm. In that light, through the front window, I saw movement inside the house, just a shape passing behind the curtain, quick, there and gone. I told myself it was the resident. Obviously, someone lived there, someone had to be putting out that envelope every time, but something about the shape didn't move like a person walking normally. It moved too fast, low to the ground almost. And I remember standing there in the rain for a few seconds just watching that window, waiting to see if it would happen again. It didn't, and I made myself leave, walking fast back to my car, not quite running, but close to it. I didn't think much more about it until I got back to the shop and mentioned the porch light being on for the first time to my manager, who I remember going quiet in a way that made me uncomfortable. He told me that house had been vacant for almost a decade, that the owner had passed away, and that the family who still technically owned it lived out of state and had never once, as far as he knew, come back to stay there. He said the orders had just started coming in one-day years before I was hired. Always paid correctly, always the same routine, and nobody working there had ever questioned it out loud until I brought it up. I quit delivering to that address after that. I told my manager I'd rather lose the tip than go back, and he didn't argue with me about it, which honestly scared me more than if he had. A couple of the other drivers asked me about it once word got around the shop, half joking, half genuinely curious, but I never gave anyone the full details. Mostly because saying it out loud made it feel more real than I wanted it to be. I still think about that flickering porch light sometimes, and the shape moving low and fast behind the curtain, in moments that have nothing to do with pizza or delivery driving at all. Just random quiet moments where my mind wanders somewhere. I'd rather it didn't. I heard from another driver that the orders stopped coming in completely about 2 months after that night. The same week I stopped working there entirely to focus on finals. I don't know if those two things are connected, whether whatever it was finally moved on or finished whatever it had been doing, or simply lost interest in ordering pizza it never seemed to actually eat, since the boxes were never left out or thrown away anywhere visible from the porch. I've never wanted to find out, and I've made a point of never driving down that road again, even years later, even though it would sometimes be the faster route home. My family used to take a road trip every summer up to my grandparents' place, about 7 hours of driving each way, and my dad always insisted on doing at least the first leg of it at night to avoid traffic and heat, which meant my sister and I spent a lot of our childhood asleep in the back seat while our parents took turns driving through the dark. I was maybe 11 the year this happened, my sister 9, and I remember it clearly enough that I still think about it more than I'd like to. That drive up to my grandparents' place was one of the fixed points of every summer growing up. The same gas station stop about 2 hours, and where my dad always bought the same brand of beef jerky. The same license plate game my sister and I played until we got bored of it somewhere around hour 4. The same argument about whose turn it was to pick the music. It was routine in the most comforting way a family tradition can be, which is probably part of why what happened that year stood out so sharply against everything that came before. And after it, we'd left later than planned that year because of some issue with packing the car. So we didn't get on the highway until almost 10 at night, already tired, already cranky, my sister already asleep against the window before we'd even left our own neighborhood. About 2 hours in, we hit a storm that the radio said was part of a larger system moving through. Heavy rain, some hail further north of us, though we thankfully avoided that part. My dad was driving, and I remember him gripping the wheel tighter than usual, leaning forward slightly to see through the rain, which even at 11 I understood meant things were bad enough to worry him. The wipers were going full speed and still barely keeping up. Visibility had dropped to maybe 30 or 40 feet in front of the headlights, and the road, which was a smaller 2-lane highway through mostly farmland at that stretch, didn't have much in the way of lighting to help. Then the engine started making a sound none of us had heard before, a kind of grinding whine, and within a minute or two, my dad had to pull onto the shoulder because the car was losing power fast. He got it stopped just off the road, hazards on, and sat there for a minute trying to figure out what had happened, while my mom got her phone out to check for signal, which was weak at best out there even in good weather. I woke my sister up because the car had gone still and quiet in a way that felt different from just stopping for gas, and she was scared, the way little kids get scared of things they can sense are wrong, even if nobody's explained it to them yet. We sat there for probably 20 minutes while my parents discussed what to do, whether to try walking to find help, whether to wait for another car to pass. Though in that stretch of road at that hour in that weather, no other cars had passed us the entire time. He'd always been the type to fix things himself rather than call for help right away, a habit from growing up on a small farm. And even at 11, I understood that him reaching for the flashlight instead of the phone meant he was still hoping. This was something simple. A loose hose or a fuse, nothing that would strand us out there for hours. I remember my dad getting out at one point to check under the hood, flashlight in hand, rain soaking him within seconds. My mom stayed in the driver's seat with us, doors locked, engine off, since it wasn't doing anything useful anyway. It was during that time, with my dad's flashlight beam bouncing around near the front of the car, that I saw something out my window. Off in the field beside the road, a shape, dark, tall, standing still despite the wind and rain bending the crops around it. Didn't say anything at first because I thought I was imagining it, the way kids do when they're tired and scared in the dark. But then my sister grabbed my arm and pointed at the same spot, without either of us having said a word to each other about it, which is the part that still gets me, even now, because it meant we were both seeing the same thing independently. My mom followed where we were pointing, and went very still herself. The shape didn't move toward us. It just stood there, at the edge of the headlight's reach, visible mostly in flashes when the lightning lit up the field behind it. My mom told my dad to get back in the car, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. And he must have heard something in her tone because he didn't argue. Just got back in soaked and confused about why she suddenly seemed panicked over engine trouble. We sat in that car for almost 40 minutes with the shape still visible out there in the field, not approaching, just present, until finally another car did pass, slowing down when they saw our hazards, and my dad flagged them down for help getting a tow. By the time we all had our attention on the new car and the process of getting a tow truck called, I looked back toward the field, and the shape was gone. My parents never really talked about it afterward, not directly, though I caught them exchanging a look in the rearview mirror a couple times over the rest of that trip that told me they'd seen exactly what my sister and I had seen. It's one of those things our family just doesn't discuss, the way some families don't discuss certain relatives or certain years. My sister and I talked about it exactly twice in all the years since, both times late at night at family gatherings when everyone else had gone to bed, both times ending the conversation quickly because neither of us wanted to sit with it for very long. She remembers the shape a little differently than I do. She says it seemed to have its arms down at its sides the whole time, while I remember one arm slightly raised, like it was reaching, though I've never been fully sure if that's a real memory or something my mind added later to make the story scarier in hindsight. We still make that same drive most summers. My own kids in the back seat now instead of me, and I catch myself watching the fields go by, sometimes with an attention that probably looks strange to anyone who doesn't know why. We don't take that particular stretch of road at night anymore, not if we can help it, even though it adds almost 40 minutes to the trip going the long way around, and my dad, even now, still won't fully explain why he agreed to the detour the first time my mom suggested it. All those years ago, he just goes quiet and changes the subject, the same way he always has. I got into storm photography almost by accident, originally just wanting better shots for my own social media, and it turned into something closer to a serious hobby, chasing systems across the state whenever the forecast lined up with my days off from my regular job. I wasn't a professional storm chaser, nothing like the people you see on television driving straight at tornadoes. Mostly I just liked capturing lightning over open fields or coastlines, the kind of shots that take patience and a willingness to stand outside and weather most people are actively trying to avoid. This happened on a night. I'd driven almost 2 hours out to a stretch of coastline, known for good lightning shots because of how the storms rolled in off the water, giving you long sight lines to catch strikes before they hit land. I'd done this particular spot maybe half a dozen times before without incident. Always alone, always with a tripod, a decent camera. and enough patience to stand in bad weather for hours waiting for the right shot. Storm chasing photography, at least the way I did it, was less about adrenaline and more about patience, honestly. Most nights ended with nothing usable at all. Hours spent standing in the cold, staring at a horizon that refused to cooperate, checking radar apps every few minutes to see if a cell was strengthening or dying out before it ever reached me. I'd gotten good enough at reading the patterns that I rarely wasted a full trip anymore, which is part of why I trusted my instincts enough to stay out later than I should have that particular night. The storm that night was more intense than the forecast had suggested, enough that I debated turning back at one point. But I was already most of the way there and didn't want to waste the drive. I parked at the small pull-off near the coast, set up my gear under a tarp rigged to keep the worst of the rain off the camera, and started shooting, mostly wide shots of the horizon where I could see the storm cells lit up from within by near constant lightning. I remember the wind picking up hard enough that I had to weigh down my tripod with a sandbag I always kept in the trunk for exactly that reason, and the rain was coming in almost horizontal off the water, stinging when it hit exposed skin. I stayed out there longer than I probably should have, chasing one more good strike, the kind of shot that makes the whole cold, wet night worth it. I got what I thought was a great sequence. 3 or 4 strikes in quick succession, lighting up a bank of clouds out over the water, and I remember feeling satisfied enough to pack up not long after that. Cold and soaked through despite my rain gear. I didn't look through the shots properly until I got home and dried off, sitting at my computer with a towel still around my shoulders, scrolling through the images on the bigger screen. Most of them were exactly what I expected. Good clean lightning shots, the kind I'd post and get decent engagement on. But there was one taken during a strike that had lit up the shoreline itself rather than just the clouds, that showed something I hadn't seen with my own eyes while I was standing there. Down near the waterline, in that brief flash of illumination, there was a figure standing at the edge of the water, facing away from the camera toward the sea. I zoomed in as far as the image quality would allow, and the shape was clearly humanoid, standing straight, not moving in a way you'd expect from someone walking or reacting to weather, just standing facing the water in a spot I was almost certain had been empty the entire time I was shooting. Since I would have noticed another person out there with me in conditions like that, and nobody had passed my car on the way in or out, I sat with that photo for a long time that night, comparing it against the other shots from the same sequence, the ones taken seconds before and after. In the shot right before, the beach is empty. In the shot right after, it's empty again. Just that one frame, that one strike of lightning. As the figure standing there, I don't consider myself someone who spooks easily, given how many hours I've spent alone in remote places waiting on weather, but that photo unsettled me enough that I didn't go back to that spot again. Not that season, not the next one either. I kept meaning to look into the history of that stretch of coastline, whether anything had happened there that might explain it. Drownings, accidents, anything, but I never got around to it. And eventually my hard drive failed about a year later, and I lost most of my older photo archives, that one included. I did eventually mention it to another photographer I'd met through an online storm-chasing community, someone with a lot more experience than me, and instead of dismissing it the way I half expected, she told me she'd heard similar accounts from other people who shot lightning along coastlines specifically. Figures that only showed up in the photographs and never to the naked eye, always near the waterline, always facing away from the camera toward the sea. She didn't have an explanation either, just said it happened often enough among people in that hobby that most of them stopped talking about it publicly, worried it would make them sound unstable or attention-seeking. I still have copies of some of my other storm shots from around that time, backed up in different places on old hard drives and a couple of cloud accounts I barely check anymore. But that specific photo is gone now, and some days I'm honestly relieved about that, even though there's another part of me that still wishes I'd made a print of it before the drive failed, just to have something physical to look at again and try to make sense of. I don't know what I would have done with it if I'd kept it, whether I'd have shown people or hidden it away in a drawer somewhere. I'm not sure I want to know what else might have shown up if I'd gone looking for a pattern across all my old storm shots. And some nights when I'm out shooting a new storm rolling in over open water, I catch myself checking the shoreline a little more carefully than I used to, half hoping and half dreading that I'll see it again.